As the story was told by my great-grandfather and passed down through our family, I can only attest to his honest nature. It's been said that he was so honest that my great-grandmother would not ask if that dress made her look pretty, and she told their 6 children to never ask which one was his favorite. My grandfather swore that when he was told this tale, it was the only time he'd ever witnessed fear cross his father's eyes, and his father had been a judge who had handled some of the most terrifying and notorious trials of the 20th century. My father had been sworn to secrecy by his father, and he wasn't told until my father was a young senator with ambitions towards the highest office in the land. Fear, yet also the utmost respect. My father told me on the night that I was sworn into office as the first woman congressional representative in the history of my state, that his father revered this story he was telling, and my father grew to revere it himself. My father placed his hand on my shoulder and looked into my eyes, deeply into my eyes, as if searching for any sign of flinching or disloyalty. This is the tale of my great-grandfather and the night of October 31st. The moon was full. It was overcast with large, puffy clouds passing through its orange glow. The group of 7 young men, students, attending a large, well-known university on the East Coast, stood, wool coats buttoned up, scarves wrapped tightly around their necks, leather gloves covering their hands, dress pants, brown leather wingtip shoes, their hair immaculately combed. They'd each received a handwritten note, which read, "Dear Sirs, you are invited by special vote to apply to become one, to enter into the Society of Giants and Kings, a society that has given rise to the most powerful men on earth, presidents and kings, tycoons and philanthropists. We are truly and wholly all for one and one for all. The needs of one are the needs of all. The success of one is the success of all. The rise of all is for one to also rise. This is a centuries-old pact among men, requiring the utmost of secrecy. Keeping the oath of secrecy is in no way a request, but rather a commandment passed down through time. We are everywhere and nowhere. We hear all, we see all, and we know all. Do you have what it takes to become a giant and a king amongst men?" Then there were instructions for each man to be at what was known around campus as the Tree of Life, a huge oak tree just on the tree line of the forest that surrounded the school grounds. They were told to be there at midnight, although they were not told that others had been sent the note, nor what they were to do after arriving. One by one they gathered by the tree and stood silently. George Haywood and Robert Greene came to the tree together and were the final 2 to arrive. There the men stood for an hour as the grass grew damp around their feet and the cold night air became a dense and silent fog. The young men had not spoken when suddenly Grayson Chancellor broke the silence. "What are we doing?" he bemoaned. "Is this some type of prank?" The others looked at him, but only one, Richard Hampstead, answered. "I received a note." "As did I," whispered Colin Jacobson. "Well, what did they say?" demanded Grayson. Kyle Gentry spoke up then and relayed what his note said, and also commented that his girlfriend had warned him that it was a Halloween prank, told him that this was some old wives' tale, and had mocked him for wanting to go. As the men grew restless, my great-grandfather spoke not a word. He instead pulled his wool collar up around his ears, the scarf covering his face to his eyes, and that's when he saw it. 2 lights flickering off in the distance, in the woods themselves. He remained silent. George Haywood was the next to spot them. "Hey, fellas, look there." He pointed, and the men turned, and from seemingly out of nowhere, a man stepped from the fog. He could have been there the entire time, or was just showing himself then. It was impossible to tell because of the dense gray fog that surrounded the group. When he spoke in a low voice, it made the men jump. My great-grandfather had already noted this man's arrival, and he was determined to show no fear. For if this was some prank, he would not lend his name to those being taunted for the remainder of their time at the university, but if in fact this was real, he felt that he had even more reason to be utterly aware of how his emotions and reactions were perceived. "Hello all. We see that you have arrived." His voice seemed to be that of an older man. My great-grandfather squinted his eyes just a bit to get a better look, and that is when he nearly did jump. The man was dressed in a long black coat reaching to the ground, black boots with silver buckles, black gloves, and a hood covering his head, except for his face, which was covered by paint, theater makeup, and he appeared as a skeleton. Bright white features of his nose, cheekbones, chin, and black sunken cheeks and eye sockets. The look was terrifying, and by the silence that fell upon the other men, my great-grandfather knew that he wasn't the only one to find this figure so. "Gentlemen, your task is an easy one. One by one, you will enter the dark forest. One by one, you will find your way along the path that will lead you to an opening, a circle of trees, in which you will find a pile of stones. Once you have found the large stone pile, you will pick up a stone and call out the final words of Sir Edgar Allen Poe. 'Lord, help my poor soul.' Upon hearing the man call out these words, the next of you shall go and do the same. Do you understand?" All the men nodded. "The first of you shall be George Haywood." George stepped out from amongst the group, which had come together closely, as if to feel safer, as if anyone in the situation these men found themselves in could feel safe. "Go now," said the skeletal man form. As George headed slowly towards the woods, which the men could barely see through the fog, the group watched as the flickering flames in the forest disappeared. It felt like hours, but was probably no more than 30 minutes, and the men then heard George call out, "Lord, help my poor soul." They breathed a collective sigh of relief. Next to be told to go was Robert Greene, then Grayson Chancellor, then Richard Hampstead, Colin Jacobson, then Kyle Gentry. Finally, it was my great-grandfather's turn. He had stood in the same spot for hours by then. At the end, it had been just him and the skeletal figure. When Kyle called out, he expected to hear the man call his name, but he heard nothing. The fog was thick and swirling around him as he slowly turned his head to look at the figure for his direction to go, but the figure, wasn't there, or wasn't where my great-grandfather could see him any longer. So, my great-grandfather began to walk towards the blackness. That's the only way he could describe it. The blackness, the forest nearly hidden by the fog, could only be made out because it was darker than anything else in that dense night. My great-grandfather stepped on the cold, damp grasses until he felt the land change and could faintly hear the crunching of leaves. He put both hands out in front of him to feel for trees. He felt one upon another, until he finally came to an opening. The path. He began to walk, still holding out his hands, feeling as though he were blind. He walked and walked until his hand reached out and he did not feel a tree in front of nor beside him. This must be the clearance, he thought, and suddenly his boot kicked a large stone. "Ah," he said. He bent down to pick it up, and when he did, the flickering lights were lit one by one until there were many, dozens even. Even in the fog he could now see, and what he saw terrified him to his soul. All the figures appeared the same as the man who had joined them in the grass, a crowd of skeletal figures holding lanterns. But what grasped his soul was the figures of the men that he had been standing next to on the grass, each one on the ground, each one bleeding profusely from their head, a stone laying next to them, blood-red stones. And there, beside him, was Kyle Gentry, sitting in the dirt, blood on his gloves, on his coat, and several drops on his face. One skeletal figure stepped out from the rest and called my great-grandfather's name. "You, sir, are the last to be called. You are the only man amongst you who did not utter a single word to anyone about the details of this evening. You have one last task, to become a giant among men, a king of nations. Do you wish to proceed?" My great-grandfather nodded in affirmation, as he was in fear for his life. And as he did, his mind was whirling in a state of confusion. The night, the scene before him, and the voice of the man speaking. He recognized that voice. "Then take your stone and crush the head of the one who broke the commandment given to you on this night." My great-grandfather looked into the eyes of Kyle. He was terrified, his body frozen in fear, as my grandfather brought the stone down upon his head and called out, "Lord, help my poor soul." The skeletal figure whom had been speaking stepped over to my great-grandfather and embraced him tightly. "Congratulations, son," he heard his father whisper. "The blood you have taken will ensure that our family line will grow with the giants and kings." Then he handed my great-grandfather a ring, a gold ring, inscribed with the symbol of Ra, the god of the sun. My father then handed me my ring as he was done telling the story, just as I am now handing you yours, my son.